This is Radio TV Phono Nut, another radio I dug out. This is an RCA AM alarm clock radio, and it plays pretty good. But it has this infamous white RCA power cord with green gunk coming out of it, and I really don't trust that. You know, over time it could compromise the connections where the wire is actually attached to the prongs and where the wire is soldered to the circuit board inside the radio. So I would like to replace the power cord with a nice new one. Here's the model tag, and somebody wrote on here 2/14/69. I believe that's Valentine's Day or National Singles Recognition Day, whatever you choose to observe. And it has the new style RCA block logo that they started using sometime in '68. So let's open it up and have a look at the inside. Here's the inside, and it looks to be a USA made chassis with some foreign components on it, which surprises me because I was thinking by 1967 Hitachi was building all of RCA's radios, and I've certainly never seen a USA chassis and a RCA set with a block logo on it. So maybe they had some leftover chassis and they were just trying to get rid of those. This black goop on here is all melted. That looks like some kind of something they had on there to keep the back panel, which has the speaker mounted to it, from resonating. And now it's all melted, but I'm really not too worried about that. Here's the power cord where it attaches to the clock motor. So we'll just slap another one on there and clean this up a bit, and we ought to have a good radio. And with much finagling, we got our strain relief out, and I also managed to get some of the black goo that's melted on me. That seems to happen. It's just like the belts that melt. They seem to find a way to get on your skin, and it's not the easiest stuff to get off. Here's our cord, new cord mounted in the strain relief. I just used the vice grips to squeeze the strain relief together, and now we'll work it back in the hole and then solder the new power cord to the appropriate connections in the radio. Yeah, this board's got Japanese parts on it, but it definitely looks like a USA-made board. Alright, I just learned something interesting, so I'm glad I took this apart. I was always under the assumption that when RCA stopped producing radios themselves in roughly '67, that they farmed them all out to Hitachi. And I first thought that this was a leftover chassis from the RCA USA production era, but that's not the case. It is a USA made radio, but look at the EIA number, EIA 742. Now that corresponds to Esquire Radio Corporation. I don't know much about that company, but I think they were more into making radios for other people than they were making radios under their own brand name. I know a long time ago I had an early 50s clock radio that was branded Esquire, but I know they made all of the radios for Montgomery Ward Airline in the 60s and into the 70s. Not only did they make radios for them, they also made their stereos and record players for a while. And I think I've got a Channel Master tube radio here that was made by Esquire and was also sold under the Ward's Airline name. So, yeah, this is pretty interesting. An RCA branded radio that was made by Esquire in the United States, not farmed out to Japan. Here's another RCA clock radio that I picked up. Unfortunately, this is a parts radio. If it was in better shape, it would be the more collectible radio of the two, and it has the same chassis as this little set does here. What's wrong with this radio is the volume knob was missing, and that's one on there from an old TV knob stash. There's a crack in the clock face. half of one of the feet is chipped off. Now the radio played, but I robbed the speaker out of it for something else, and I'm probably going to rob the clock motor out of it to put in that Westinghouse clock radio that I was given a while back. You might remember the video I did on it where the speaker was bad, and it had a bad cap on the chassis too, so I think this clock runs, and if it does, I'm just going to take the motor out of it and put it in the Westinghouse. But yeah, it's kind of a shame this one got beat up, because like I said, this would be the more collectible of the two radios if it were in better shape. Look at all this goop. The best thing I'm finding so far to get it off is my control cleaner. I could use rubber renew, but to clean off what got on the plastic cabinet, that would have it would not only get the goop off, but it would also mess up the cabinet too. That stuff's powerful stuff, so we're just going to use the contact cleaner and get as much of this crap off as we can and be done with it. Okay, I got most of the black crap off by scraping and neutralizing it with my contact cleaner, so there's not much of that left to get off on me or anybody else or anything else anymore. Well, hopefully this thing will play now. I'm going to finish putting it all back together and solder the speaker back up, and hopefully it'll be okay. Just a word of warning, when you're putting these types of radios back together, whether they be tube or solid state, I'd say radios made between the 50s and early 70s, be careful, because this plastic, I believe it's styrene, and it's actually very brittle, especially when it gets old. So don't over tighten the screws, because the plastic will crack. In fact, I could hear the plastic stressing as I was tightening these screws back down, but we didn't crack anything, and there once again, nobody ever envisioned that these little cheap radios would still be around 50 years later being serviced. They probably figured 5 to 10 years and they'd be in the trash and the customer would buy a new radio. Only thing was, these radios were so good, they just kept going and going and going and going and didn't cause any problems, so why replace? You know, I got to thinking about the date written on the bottom of this radio, Valentine's Day. I'm sure some young lady was happy to receive this little radio back in the late 60s. A cheap, low-end, AM-only clock radio, no buzzer alarm, no snooze button, just a basic AM clock radio, and I'm sure she was tickled to death with it. It just goes to show you how things have changed over the decades in today's world. And before I go any further, let me just say I don't think everybody's like this, but a good majority of the people now, if you gave her a basic clock radio for Valentine's Day, she'd probably throw it at you. Now they expect the expensive stuff, you know, the new iPhones and the new set of tires for the car, and on and on and on. But just goes to show you how we've changed over the years, and not always for the better. Well, there it is on WDIA, I think.
Frugal living, like you. What was your first career?
Available without a prescription.
School or what? God wants us to be happy and peaceful. It even gives us the key to feeling that way. Brought to you by the Ad Council and its pre-diabetes awareness partners.
I know they got their laws. I don't know. They just They don't look. But they fall down from where they were.
Well, it plays.
Seattle didn't.
Well, I knew something would go haywire. It was just playing and just faded on out. And all I'm getting is a hiss from the speaker, and that's it. So I guess we're gonna have to tear back into this and see what happened. Alright, checking the old capacitors. Our 100 microfarad filter reads 60, so that one's on the weak side. Our 210 microfarads, they're the only two that checked a little questionable on ESR on this meter here. They both read about 30 apiece. This 100 here reads about 280, and this 100 here reads 122. So, yeah, they, measuring them with both meters, you can tell they're kind of on their way out, needed to be changed. So now all we got to do is find out why the radio faded into oblivion. And it could be a transistor. I doubt it, because I would think when a transistor failed, it would just go. It would be playing 1 minute and not playing the next, although with old transistors, and I think these are germaniums in here, anything's possible. A resistor that for whatever reason suddenly jumped up in value, although they usually don't go up like that abruptly, but anything can happen. But it's getting late in the day, the camera is about full, the battery needs to be recharged. So I think we need to just sleep on it overnight, come down here tomorrow with a full memory card and a fully charged camera battery and see why this radio decided to take a dump on us. Maybe it's as tired of the local AM programming as I am. Alright, it's another day. We're back down here. The radio's been sitting all night in the cold workshop.
Old Highway 80 West is just...
And now it's playing.
Appetizers like crab claws, fried or sauteed.
And as you can tell, it just faded into oblivion, so I think whatever it is obviously very heat sensitive. Nothing but a little hiss from the speaker. Alright, I'm checking the voltage. We have this resistor here that drops the higher voltage down to a lower level for the signal stages. I've got 30 volts going into that resistor and 7.4 coming out. Now, considering that's a 100 volt filter capacitor, I'd say 30 volts going into that resistor seems a little low, and what's coming out of it seems a tad low too. So I think we're going to investigate that area. I've always been taught that when you get a piece of equipment that's not working properly, the first thing you do is verify the power supply voltages. Now, I don't have a schematic to this radio, and I'm going to try to fix it without one if possible. So right now I'm just guessing at what the voltages should be. Okay, I just realized I made a terrible mistake. Human error, and it happens to all of us. I installed the filter capacitor in backwards, and I can feel the top of it, and it's a little puffed up and a little warm, so at least we know these are real heavy-duty filter capacitors that don't go pop, pop, boom as soon as you put them in backwards. So why don't we take this out and put a fresh one in here? It burns me up. Ruined a brand new capacitor. And I'll note on these boards they don't have it marked where positive and negative is located. And I called myself trying to be careful and put these things in correctly, but apparently I didn't put this one in right. So let's flip it around and see what happens. That's better. That's better.
Whatever it was.
What tipped me off to my mistake is I was looking at the top side of the board, and I noticed the negative lead of the filter capacitor where it was situated, and then I looked at the bottom of the board and noticed it was going to the audio output transformer, and I said, that's not right. And then when I examined the capacitor, I noticed it was starting to vent on top and get a little warm, so I'm like, yeah, I blew it. I stuck it in backwards. And let's check that voltage at that resistor and see what it is now with the capacitor in correct. Alright, coming straight off of the capacitor, 104 volts. Before we had about 30. Alright, coming off of the dropping resistor that gives us our low voltage for the signal stages, 20.8. So what was happening was, with that capacitor in backwards, it was effectively placing a short, not a hard short, but enough of a short to load the power supply down. And it's interesting to note that we have 104 volts coming off of the filter capacitor, and the original capacitor was only rated for 100 volts. So that explains why that capacitor was probably reading half of its rated value. It had been stressed to the max all these years, and they should have put at least 150 volt one in there from the factory. Now, let's put the radio back together, and hopefully this thing is fixed this time. Alright, there's weak YLS coming in at 670, so that tells me this thing is working like it should.
Positioned him, and they want him to be unelectable in the next election. Because he stands for the people.
910.
He's done more of the people's business.
73% of men said they do.
I like to take my daily walk, and one of the things I'm intentional about is safety. That's why I was excited to discover Tiger Lady.
You were so...
All one, and every man shall his own reward according to his own
well, or with the team, or they're out with injuries, and Steve Kerr knows he has to work a little harder.
Alright, I am going to have to find something to put in the back of this cabinet to keep it from resonating. That's the reason they had all that gooey rubber crap in there, to keep the cabinet from vibrating. But that concludes this episode of the Relabeling Corporation of America clock radio. Seems like RCA started doing that a lot in later years. They farmed out their radio production to Hitachi and other companies. And even in the 80s, their VCR production was farmed out to either Hitachi or Matsushita, and even some of their projection TVs were farmed out to Hitachi. You know, it's a shame that companies, instead of building stuff themselves, they farmed it out to somebody else, and the reason they did that is because they realized they could get it done cheaper, as in buying a cheaper product that way and then slapping their name on it. But anyway, I was thinking back, and in my memory, this is the second time in my life that I've installed a filter cap backwards. The first time was years ago in a little 5-tube Philco. Well, that capacitor wasn't patient with me. It blew up as soon as I turned it on, and took the rectifier tube out and a couple other things with it too. So I'm glad that didn't happen this time. But there you go. And I'm not going to do it now, but I'm thinking maybe I can get some kind of foam padding or weather stripping or whatever, and cut it down to the right size, and just run it along the inside rim of this back cover to where the back will snugly be sitting in place, and then it won't resonate. Oh, and someone was asking me about the Japanese radio. Do you think the 3.5-inch speaker has to do with its poor sound quality? Yeah, I think it's partly due to them using a El Cheapo speaker, but that's not the only reason. This radio here uses a 3.5-inch speaker, and it's pleasing to listen to. It's not a tinny-sounding nightmare that'll give you a headache to listen to. The Japanese radio, like someone pointed out on one of the Facebook groups, those things sold for as little as $5. and they use the cheapest of the cheap components, cheap output transformer, minimal circuit design, cheap speaker, and all of that contributes to poor sound quality. However, this radio here, even though it's a lower-end radio, they did put some effort into it, and it is a pleasing radio to listen to. So there you go. The lesson learned from this video is pay attention to what you're doing and make sure you don't install your capacitors backwards. If it's not marked on the board, you might ought to mark it on the board before you pull the cap out.